Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another edition of Mere Tradition. I'm your host, Kennedy Hall. I've got a very special guest today, Miss Janet Smith. She's a storied professor, author, been in defense of Catholic moral theology for a really long time. And we both write for Crisis Magazine. I understand why they let her write for them. I'm still not sure why they let me. And it's an honor to have you on the show today, Janet. Perhaps there's things you might want to fill in with your biography here if I missed anything important.
Well, I'm retired now, and I've been working a long time and still am working on defending the church's teachings on sexuality. And I've been surprised, though, that in my retirement, it seems that God has asked me to do a lot of work on the sex abuse crisis. And that has been very unsettling for me. It's taken me into a realm of corruption in the church that I was very protected from, for whatever reason, for my whole life. And now to see, and it's obviously not just in the church, it's in the government, and it goes back a long way. And a person as naive as I am and was raised in a very trusting household of good people that just thought you were supposed to do what is right and not distrust others, and everything would be fine. And just finding out the extent of the corruption and the demonic presence has been extremely unsettling. But also what I'm sort of known for in the last couple of years is my reversion to absolute devotion to the traditional Latin Mass. And that's been my huge consolation in the face of my disillusionment about mankind, the church and the culture and the government. So I'd say that's the picture of where I am right now.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I'm going to show on the screen here for the viewers. We are going to discuss, Janet visited Uganda earlier this year. And there's a series of articles you can see, ladies and gentlemen, on the screen that she posted for Crisis Magazine. And there's about four of them, I think, maybe 4 or 5. And it goes through her trip in Uganda. She was invited there to speak about the issue of homosexuality in the culture and in the church. And it's a very interesting expose into the major differences between Africa. And of course, Africa is a continent. Uganda is not the same as all the other countries. That would be like saying Germany is the same as Italy. Nonetheless, there does seem to be some sort of cultural cohesion in the Christian sense in sub-Saharan Africa. So you had a good experience with that. So I guess the first thing maybe we can start the conversation with is in the West, loosely called the West, in sort of conservative Catholic circles, the African Catholic presence is seen as almost like a promised land. It's going to save the church and so on and so forth. Everything is hunky-dory. And objectively speaking, just from a statistical perspective, things are leap years or light years more of a higher quality in Africa when it comes to Catholicism. But what was your initial impression of Africa, Ugandan Catholicism, in light of how we've seen it, sort of just in snippets in the narrative here?
Excellent. Again, I was only there for 3 weeks, and it amounts to huge hubris or arrogance to think that you can really get the pulse of a place in just 3 weeks. But you can report on what your experience was. Whether that experience is ultimately absolutely representative of the reality, that's another question. But I was invited by a wonderful priest. I think anybody who some people say it was the highlight. And I said, well, the highlight might have been spending 3 weeks in a car with this unbelievable priest. And I also took with me Kevin Wells, who was another author for Crisis Magazine. And so the 3 of us in the car, it was a lot of time in the car. And in fact, often it was a big truck because the roads are so bad. You need a very hefty vehicle to keep you moving on the roads. And the traffic in the city is unbelievable. It's only two lanes, and it's totally crazy. So it was meeting the people and meeting a lot of priests. I didn't get any chance really to talk to seminarians. And if I go again, which they want me to do, I will really try to arrange some conversations with seminarians. But from all appearances, the seminarians are extremely disciplined, very, very receptive, very attentive. And the priests, it was a delight to talk to them. One thing about the Ugandan character, anyways, there seems to be an enormous amount of transparency. I could say things in the seminaries there, and the seminarians could say things in the seminaries. The questions they asked, for instance, I don't think they would be allowed in U.S. seminaries, or at least the seminarians would be so frightened of endangering their vocation that they wouldn't ask certain questions. So my topic was homosexuality, of all things, and that was decided upon by the bishops that are in charge of the seminary committee, that's what they wanted me to speak on, which is a bit odd in almost every respect, because they don't seem to have a problem with homosexuality in Uganda in the sense that we do. As a matter of fact, they think we're all homosexuals. They kind of giggled and said to me, we think everybody in the United States is gay. And I said, I can see why. It's in the media just non-stop. They almost don't understand the phenomena of homosexuality. Most of them would say, almost all of them would say, I've never known one. I don't know why anybody would ever be attracted to that. We might say the same thing, I'm sure we would, about cannibalism. Why would anybody do that? I don't know any cannibalists. That's more or less their response to homosexuality, except, of course, that when the HIV became a huge problem in every country in the world, it was in Uganda. And that's where sort of the homosexual element emerged, because it was being spread. And they put in very strict laws about homosexuality. If you were a predator, or you were if you were a predator on the vulnerable, it's capital punishment is the response. And otherwise, if you are an active homosexual or an advocate, it's life imprisonment. Now, so far as I can tell, those aren't often, if ever, applied. But as we all know, the law is incredibly educative, and that gives a sense to the whole culture what they think about it, what the culture thinks about it. They were trying to protect the innocent that homosexual predators were going after during the HIV crisis, because they couldn't get adult men to have sex with them, so they went after boys. Apparently, that's not so different right now, in the sense that the LGBT community, the NGOs, that are pushing, obviously, for Uganda to change its laws. They were many organizations, the HWO, and many organizations have stopped giving money for food, economic development to Uganda, because these organizations think that they violate basic human rights. And I could tell that the seminarians were concerned about this. Are people going to starve? Do we need to change our laws? And the big, and of course I tried to say, no, stay the course. And that's, to a certain extent, that was my purpose for going there, saying, don't become like us, stay the course. Dig in your heels. Don't let this happen to your culture. And apparently 100% of Ugandans believe in God, 100%. I heard that many times. And I thought, oh my goodness. And I would say to them that we couldn't say in some public debate that homosexuality is an abomination in God's eyes. They're saying, why couldn't you say that? Because we can't say God, and we can't say anything negative about homosexuality. So I was trying to get them to hold the course. Again, many of these LGBT groups, they have members of their own group that are seducing young boys. They're paying their school tuition and having the boys have sex with them, and then invite another boy to come and join the sex-having crowd so they can pay school tuition. And of course, the boys wouldn't dream of telling their parents. So this is the wedge that the West is using. The wedge is a threat of not giving economic aid to a country that desperately needs it, and preying on young boys who are living in poverty and can't afford to go to school in order to push the homosexual agenda in Uganda.
Does it seem like there's a concerted effort in an official sense to make that sort of tuition arrangement happen? Or is that more of is it something where you had the impression that, Western NGOs are doing that on purpose, or is it more of something that's just kind of in the underbelly?
Well, what I heard from, several people gave me this when I would say, is there a problem with homosexuality in Uganda? And they would all instantly say no. And then they say, except the LGBT groups have an agenda to bring it here. And one of their motives or one of their means is the seduction of young boys and paying their tuition. And again, they didn't comment on whether it was more or less a unspoken policy or if it was just a fact of what was happening.
That's very well. So, yeah, that's fast. It's fascinating not in a good way. It's obviously just a fascinating data point. So you mentioned these seminarians who are asking these open questions. Ought we to consider changing our laws and so forth? This is one thing that I was thinking about before we came on to the show here. We look at Africa from the West as this place that's just totally different than any other place. It's we think, it's just there's something different about it where they could never have these issues that we have in the West. But if you were to talk to an Italian or a Frenchman or an Anglo in in Australia or England 70 years ago, they would never in a million years think that you would have the woke stuff happening either. It just wasn't part of the conversation for anyone with a semblance of basic natural law morality, whether Christian or Muslim. But it's happened. So did you see anything there where you thought they need to get a hold on sort of maybe, like I would say, if they don't have a strong hold on basically the media that's allowed in their country, the social media, that it's going to be very difficult to stop the flooding of this propaganda. Did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think, again, that's pretty much precisely why I was there. You can just, and many of them see it. Many of the priests who were faculty at the seminaries have spent time in Rome or in London or in Spain. They're certainly very learned men in many ways and aware. But most of the seminarians, so far as I could tell, they're not greatly clued into social media at the moment. The seminary has almost no computers. And they have almost no books. They have no textbooks. Everything is done by lecture, which isn't the worst possible thing in this world. As we say, Socrates didn't have any books, nor did his students. But one plan I do have is to try to get together a shipment, if not more, of books to Uganda for their libraries. But I didn't get the sense that the young men, there were a few because of the questions they asked, you could tell that they were following things on the internet. The rest of them, it seemed it wasn't the case. They do have phones, and the phones are given them by the Chinese in order to get all their data, as they're doing everywhere. And so there's this, they're on so far as I could tell, they're on the precipice of something. And I think one of the reasons they invited me to come, which again, I was astonished. I asked a bishop there who's in charge of the seminaries. I said, did you get me vetted? Did you call some bishops in the United States and ask them who I was and would be a good idea to invite me? I think 15 years ago, they all would have said yes. In the last 5 years, there wouldn't be very many that would say that. And he just kind of scoffed. He said, why would I do that? He said, it would just take so much time. And he said, this Father Alex who invited you, I trust him. And that was my sense of how things operate in Africa. They're very open, and they know what's coming. They chose the topic, and they know what's coming, and they knew what I would say, and they wanted me to say it. When I would say things, can I say things like a really high, let's say a very putting percentage is difficult, but a percentage, and a very alarming percentage, of U.S. bishops are active homosexuals or totally corrupt in their protection of homosexuals. Can I say that? And they would say, you say whatever you want to say. You say whatever you think we need to hear. And again, that's the sense I got with the questions that the seminarians asked. That again, some of the questions I thought, in a U.S. seminary, they wouldn't ask that because they'd be afraid that they'd be labeled in a certain way if they asked those questions. So the scenario that I felt that I went into, and I think this was verified when I got there, was that they certainly think homosexuality is wrong. I have no doubt about that. And they know it's wrong by natural law, by the whole tradition of their culture. They know that it's wrong because of Scripture. They can have any doubt about that. It's never even occurred to them to doubt that. But at the same time, they have absolutely no understanding of the causes of homosexuality and the challenges that are faced by men and women who experience same-sex attraction. They couldn't even imagine the scenario, but I said, I suspect if a young man came home and said that an LGBTQ activist has seduced me and now I find myself with same-sex attraction, the young man would most likely be disowned, would never see his family again. And I said, this is a problem. I said, it's not his fault that he was seduced. And I mean, there's been some occasions where a priest will come back from some foreign country and may engage in sexual intercourse with some seminarians. It's very, very rare, but it happens. Now they dismiss the young men immediately. And I said, well, what do you do to the priests? And they said, we don't know what to do. And maybe we put him in a convent or something. I said, would you please talk? I'm going to put you in contact with some bishops, at least one bishop in the United States that I know who I think has done a marvelous job of dealing with the problem, and talk to him, because the boys all need some attention. They need a lot of pastoral care because they've been abused. And the church, in a sense, representatives of the church have launched them on a lifestyle that they did not choose. And I said, what I'm here is to try to get you to stand the ground on fighting homosexuality in the culture and any infiltration in the church. But you need to develop some compassion for those who I think are thrust into the homosexual lifestyle. And it was a very foreign thought to them that the church needed to do some pastoral care for those who experience same-sex attraction. Again, they're open to it. One of the last breakfast meals I had was with a priest who is a psychologist, and he said, can you send me some information on what those programs might look like? So it was that kind of openness that I was encouraged by. I was blowing their minds. Those gifts, I guess, where you see people's minds explode. I sort of saw that happening over and over again right in front of my eyes as I spoke to the group. I got a very positive response from Father Alex, but a good friend of mine went to Uganda, had an occasion to talk to bishops and priests while he was there, and said the same thing, that he basically heard only good things about my presentation. If I had given these same presentations in U.S. seminaries, oh my gosh. One of the reasons I retired was I was totally unsettled, as many of us were, by the McCarrick situation. And I could tell my seminarians were. And no one was talking to them about it, nobody. And I was, again, I'm spectacularly naive in many respects. And I went to talk to the administrators of the seminary and say, I'm talking to the seminarians about this because I'm working on it. And I said, I just want you to know that. And they were sort of like, well, go carefully. I said, why? And they said, well, because I don't know if they can handle it. I said, they're adult men. Yeah. I said, they're adult men. And if we don't talk to them about it and we don't help them work out whatever the right way to think is about this, what are we doing? What's our job? But I basically promised I would not. I said, okay, I won't talk to him about it. I get back to the classroom. Really, I walk into a classroom, and a student asks me, Professor Smith, we hear you're working on the sex abuse crisis. What are you learning? Again, I just like I'd never just made a little promise that I wouldn't do it, and I just do it. The kids gave me, the guys, the young men, gave me a standing ovation afterwards because someone spoke to them about it. So being a person of, I mean, not able to keep her promises, but nonetheless having some integrity, I walked right back to the office, and I just said, I just want you to know what I just did. I'm sorry. I couldn't, I thought they needed to know, and I wanted to be honest with them. But that's precisely one of the reasons that I took a little bit of an early retirement, because I, I was very conflicted about what I could say in a seminary, what I ought to say in a seminary. And I thought, if I can't do what the administration wants me to do, I've got other things to do. And so I bought myself a lot of liberty by retiring.
Something similar in my life. First of all, one thing, it's funny you mentioned they didn't really care if you had an endorsement from a bishop or something like that. I've been asked to speak at 2 or 3 different diocesan settings in the United States. And each time I reply back and I say, listen, I'll come. Usually to talk about my masculinity book. And I say, I'm glad to come, but I'm going to warn you that I will not be able to get a pastoral letter because I attend the Society of St. Pius X Chapel, and I can get a letter from my priest. I mean, technically, the letter just means you're not under any sort of censure. That's all it really means. And any priest, any society priest can ask Rome for that. It's not a big deal. Nonetheless, they'll write back and they say, oh, thank you, but yes, our pastor said that we can't have you. Well, the only place I was invited back when I was with the Fatima Center, there was, I think it was in Nigeria. They were asking us to come over to do a thing, and they didn't care about any of that, which is just interesting, the differences there. But also, you mentioned how, you go off into retirement a little bit early because you had to make a choice about, basically, will you be able to say what you believe you ought to say, or will you have to play the politics game, and that can be tiresome. I was about 5 or 6 years into my teaching career, and I was constantly getting into trouble, not real trouble, but trouble because I was teaching Catholicism in my Catholic religion class at my Catholic high school. And, students would ask me questions, and the administrator would say, Kennedy, be careful what you say. And I say, well, I will, but the kids asked me a question and I had the answer and I gave them the answer. They were very, very appreciative of it, but it got to the point where I realized I'm just going to have to do something else. And that's why I kind of found myself doing this weird thing that I do for a living now. So I wanted to ask you a question because... Sorry, go on.
Can I respond to
Sure.
Just a minute? Many years ago, it's probably more than 25 years ago, I was invited to a seminary in the Midwest to defend the church's teaching on contraception, invited by a student. And I was sort of brought in by the back roads of the seminary, up the freight elevator, and went into the cafeteria because it was noon hour and I just needed a little bite to eat. And there was a whole bunch of faculty sitting around. Not one of them acknowledged my presence. Not one of them nodded to me or got up to greet me. I was clearly just not welcome. And then I went to give my talk, and there were a number of faculty there. Again, they do the thing that is, they get on the peripheries, which is kind of a body language. We don't want to get too close to you. And after my talk, usually there's a very lively question and answer period, and there was none. Nobody had any questions. That's never happened. So everybody just kind of filed out. But some of the seminarians would give me a thumbs up as they were walking, that nobody behind them could see it, just by their side, so that I could see that they supported me. About 5 minutes later, the room was about at least half full again of seminarians who had questions but didn't dare ask them in front of the faculty. And that's the mood in the U.S. seminaries has been. We don't ask any hard questions. Right after the McCarrick thing, a seminarian came to visit me who had been in McCarrick's seminary in New Jersey, and I don't know what year he was, but he was taking a year of absence, a leave of absence. He said, because nobody will talk about it there. He said, nobody will talk about it. He said, finally, a couple friends and I insisted that we have some sort of open meeting with the faculty and the students. And he said he had spent part of his summer, I think it was in Colombia, but some South American country, with three other men who were drinking and womanizing the whole time, three other seminarians. There was absolutely no accountability for what they were doing. Nobody was checking up on them. He reported it back to the seminary. Of course, he got in trouble for snitching on his fellow seminarians. So they finally had a 45-minute sort of like all seminary meeting. And a young man got up at the seminary and said, I'm just sick and tired of some of the seminarians here wanting to poke into the sexual lives of other seminarians. What does it matter who's homosexual and who's not? What does it matter what we do in our private lives? And he said not one formator or faculty spoke out against this, contradicted it. And again, that is, to my mind, that portrays pretty well the level of honest confrontation with issues in U.S. seminaries. So my getting to being invited to Uganda to talk about one of the most controversial issues you can, and having a firsthand experience with being told I could say whatever I wanted to say, and I had the sense that the seminarians were, some of them were kind of even boneheaded things, which were fun. I mean, young men are boneheaded, all right? And so it's very important to allow them to say the boneheaded things they have in their minds. And his was, why should we ever forgive a homosexual? Why should he ever be forgiven? Isn't this one of the punishments that cry out to God, and it's an abomination? And so, I said, well, you say some things about every sin is forgivable, and he was citing me some passages in scripture, and I said, well, those are very selective citations of passages. I said the overall, I could say you many, many more on forgiveness. I said, but let's think about it for a minute. I said, let's think about fornication. Let's talk about having sex before you're married, or adultery outside of marriage. I said, just think of the harm that does. Just think of the harm. I said, especially if a pregnancy occurs. Now, they're all squirming at this time because young men everywhere have a problem with chastity. And so they're all squirming. And I said, so you could ruin a child's life by having a child out of wedlock. You could ruin the woman's life. They could be living in poverty. I said, what kind of man have you become if you do that? I said, so I think homosexuality is manifestly wrong. I think it's done an enormous amount of damage to our culture. But as far as the immediate personal harm done, both to the agent and the culture, the child, the mother, the family, I said fornication rates way up there with my mind of really seriously bad sins. And you could just see that, again, the discomfort in the room was fantastic. I mean, I didn't want to be there to, in a sense, trash homosexuals. I want to recognize that their priesthood. I don't know how many priests in Africa are unfaithful to their vows. Or Uganda. I tried to find information on all sorts of things. I didn't yet, or haven't yet, found it on that. But there's all sorts of stories about men having concubines and families, but. So far as I know, every study I've seen in the United States says that 50% of U.S. clergy are unfaithful to their vows of chastity at any given time. All right, that doesn't mean a whole lot more haven't been or won't be in the future. It means at this particular moment, over 50% of priests out there are being unfaithful to their vows. Now, I'm sure it's different for different cohorts, different age groups, different seminaries, different dioceses, all sorts of things. It's not a sweeping thing that you can apply to any given diocese or groups. But is it worse in Africa? I don't know. It's pretty bad here. So I didn't feel in any position that I could, either I didn't want to idealize them, that maybe they were more chaste than we are. I didn't want to demonize them, thinking that they weren't as chaste as we are, which is not chaste at all. But I wanted to acknowledge it. I wanted to bring it to the fore and include it in the presentation.
Yeah, it's traditionally, well, still today in any good seminary or traditional order, there is a requirement, as far as I can tell, that you need to demonstrate that you've been sexually pure in all aspects for at least 3 years before you enter the seminary. I know of men who have wanted to go to traditional seminaries and they, had a conversion and they're on the right path, but they had a girlfriend or something like that and were away from the faith and at some point, and they've got to wait an extra year or two to prove it. And Father Ripperger has talked about this, how the gift of celibacy, it's not necessarily some special charism per se, but it's a demonstration that one has control over his passions for a long period of time. And so I wonder if the seminaries in Uganda have that same, if they have that same standard of the 3 years before. Did you hear anything about that at all?
No, I did not, and it's a great question. It's something that maybe should have occurred to me. Um, what they are doing, which seems to me to be very important, is that they're initiating what they're calling a propedeutic year, a year before they enter formal academic studies into their theological studies. Some seminarians in the U.S. have the same thing for somewhat similar reasons, but part of it is that in the US, it's largely to detox these men from pornography and the incredibly busy lives that we all have, and try to teach them how to engage in contemplative prayer in a slower life and just build a relationship with the Lord. In Uganda, there is the problem that men are entering the seminary. I mean, each seminary I went to had 250 seminarians. I went to 5 theology seminaries, and then I spoke at one junior seminary, or minor seminary, which also had 250. And they have, I don't know how many of those they have. Got a lot of seminarians. They need a lot. It's a big country. It's got 44 million people, but they have a lot of seminarians. And a fair number of them, maybe even the vast majority, it's hard to know, go into the priesthood to have a economically reliable life, a life that they will have a roof over their head and food, and maybe even to feed their families back home. They get paid nothing. Everything is, I think they get accommodations, but as far as any money for them to spend on anything else, it comes all from mass offerings, which are pretty paltry most of the time. So they're not living the high life, but they're not entering the priesthood maybe because of a genuine call. So I asked this Father Alex about that. I said, what do you do about that? And he said, well, this is why we've set up this propedeutic year. We really want it to be a year of discernment where they get to know themselves. Excuse me, Kennedy. It's allergies. It's they want to have this propedeutic year to allow the young men to discern their motives and to really gain self-awareness and a deep understanding of what the priesthood really is, the kind of calling it is, the kind of devotion it is. And he said, my job, because he's in charge of this propedeutic year, he said, is to turn all the men have faith. I mean, none of them are pretending to believe believers. They all are true believers. They love Jesus. They love the church. But that they really have a vocation to poverty, chastity, and obedience is another question. He said, mine is to try to discern which ones don't have authentic vocations and maybe turn a lot of those that came in for not the highest of reasons to develop a genuine, to understand what it is and realize God is truly calling them to that. Since I've been there, Kevin and I have engaged in a fundraiser to fund this propedeutic year. It is their first year that they're doing it. They're just started it about a week ago. That's it. Thank you. The Arlington Latin Mass Society, God bless them. agreed to be our collecting agency for this. I wanted a 501c3 agency and someone who would collect it. And I spent about 2 months trying to find a 501c3 that would do this. And I was really beginning to despair. I had a very disappointing turn down after weeks and weeks of trying to set up a relationship. I'm sitting at my desk and I'm trying to do the devout person thing and saying, well, there's a plan in this. The reason it was turned down is I'm sure there's something better, and I'm sure I shouldn't be just completely demoralized at the time that I've spent on this, and something will happen. Well, honestly, before I could even start to act upon that attitude adjustment recognition, I get a phone call from a Matthew Penza at the Arlington Latin Mass Society, who says, I saw your note a couple weeks ago that you were looking for a 501c3. We can do that for you. And I'm just ready to fall off and he said, we can get it set up in just a couple days. And I'm like, oh my gosh. I mean, and that is what God does. I mean, I always say God brings you to the precipice and then he rescues you. And Mary always answers my prayers about 2 days ahead of time. If I'm doing a novena, about day 7, I get an answer, and that should teach me a lesson. But I keep going to God the Father, and that's what he always does, is he brings me to the point of despair, and then he rescues me. So we have raised that money. A most amazing thing, we have raised that money. God bless the generous people who, we got some very small donations, sometimes $15. God bless that person. My guess is that person is making a genuine sacrifice by giving $15. I think the highest we got was like $12,000. And I'm going to thank that person. But my guess is it's not so much a sacrifice as the widow's mite was. So we had both widow's mites, and we had nice benefactors who God has blessed financially, who bestowed some of that upon us. So we're still going to be trying to raise some money to ship these books. We're collecting books. So if anybody has books, they should contact that Arlington Latin Mass Society. One man in Florida, I think he's given us about 500 books. And I envy his library. I thought I might have to go through it and call out books that are kind of idiosyncratic or aged or something. And it's basically 500 books that any seminary library should want to have. I was just floored. And he's actually recorded all of them for me, given me a list of all of them. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the time that has to take. So he's not in a position to afford shipping those books up to Michigan. And then I have another friend who is working on getting a shipping container that evidently will hold 11,000 books. I don't know how they come up with that figure, but we've got 500. We're working on getting more. People, if they're near a seminary or a university, they might contact them and say, do you have theology books, philosophy books that, and I'm for literature and history myself. I think that priority should be given to theology and philosophy, but my goodness, as far as the liberal arts are concerned and learning about life, literature and history are extremely important. So that would be great, because the seminary library about every 5 to 10 years culls its whole collection and they get libraries, priests donate their whole libraries upon their death, and so they get many duplicates, and so they go through everything and make them available. So I would invite people to contact their local seminary or whatever college that's a religious college, what they might have.
Yeah, go to your local diocesan Catholic school and ask to see the cellar, the storage room in the basement where they have all the stuff from before the council that they haven't thrown out yet, and you'll probably find some goodies there. Okay, that's wonderful. And just to give my viewers some more incentive here, if I pull up this fundraiser again, the goal is 56,000 USD. We can always go beyond the goal, and you're just about $1,800 short of that. So perhaps viewers of this program, I'm sure there'll be thousands of you, and a couple bucks here and there, and you might be able to make them go over their goal. So that's a very easy task for the viewers to help with here. And that's very good. That's a wonderful thing, especially the books. You know, so many saints have talked about how saints have been made by good reading, and it really is important. It really is important. Okay, I wanted to ask two questions before we're at 40 minutes now. I promise we won't go more than an hour. So I wanted to ask two questions. One more about Uganda, and then one I wanted to get just your little, you know, what it was like coming to tradition for you and so forth. And so the first one about Uganda. So it's obviously very morally, I mean, the externals, of course, very morally strong. Clearly, I mean, you can read in your articles, you tell the one story about how you were at an event with youth and virtually none of them received communion because they admitted they were in a state of mortal sin from, you know, girlfriends or boyfriends or whatever, and they didn't go up for communion. And another story where at a big event, when we not know who's coming, someone sort of stands with the priest to know if so-and-so is living in a state of serious sin. So they clearly take their morals very seriously when it comes to the sacraments. Now, what about ecumenism, though? Because one of the insidious things that has destroyed so many Christian countries, so many Catholic countries, is really the virus of the ecumenia. Obviously, Africa is known, sub-Saharan Africa is known as having very strong Christian presence, but it's also got a very strong Protestant Christian presence as well. Congo, for example, if you look up the statistics, before the council, it was majority Catholic, and now it's majority Protestant. So there is this seeping away from the church to other Christian things. What is their attitude as far as your experience is concerned regarding other Christian denominations?
Well, I'm going to have to call you next time before I go and get a set of good questions because I failed in my responsibility to ask such a question. There are 44%, something like 44% of Ugandans are Catholic. 43%, I think, are Anglican. Another 11% are Muslim. And then there's a whole variety, of course, of Pentecostal sects, a little bit of Hindu, a little bit of indigenous religion. I am embarrassed to say I never asked that question. Nobody brought it up. And so there you are. Something I'll ask next time. But you can't escape the presence of the Christian presence. And it seems to me the Catholic presence. Because every little, I mean, the presence of the church is so great in the sense of schools and hospitals and even people name their stores, Saint so-and-so store, Saint so-and-so bridal store, that it's very vibrant in that sense, that everything, you're not embarrassed. In fact, you're kind of militant, but it's not militant because you're not doing it in the face of something that's resistant. Much like I went to the Philippines years ago, and I was just stunned at every little jeepy that they had, which was sort of their little transportation. They were just filled with religious pictures, filled with saints' names, and it's part of it's constant part of your environment. It's not. Now you go. Some of my family that's not so religious at all. When they come into my house and see my crucifix and my icons and this, they're kind of freaked. Like, whoa, this is so explicitly, Catholic and Christian. Well, if you're not a Christian, if you went to Uganda, you'd start freaking like that because it's everywhere. So that's a value to this, is that it's a. I mean, we went to a gas station, and there's a young man sitting there, and he has his phone in front of him. And we said, "What are you looking at?" He's reading the Bible. All right, he's the guy that pumps the gas, and we sort of had the feeling that no matter where we did this, that's what we would find. That wasn't just a freak occurrence.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. That is a beautiful thing, and I pray that Uganda stays strong. And so the last question I want to ask, it's related to one of the experiences you relate in one of your articles with your friend Father Alex. You were sort of explaining the traditional Mass, and he had no experience with it, and had, it's funny, some skepticism that sounded like the general kind of new springtime skepticism of, well, why would you do a Mass in a language that's old, that kind of thing. And then you said, listen, we just got to go to one. So you brought him to a traditional Mass, and you said his reaction was astonishing and basically floored by the thing. And he kind of said, okay, I kind of get this now, why people do this. You've mentioned you've had this major reversion to tradition, and I guess it's a broad question, but why did you come back to tradition? Why was it that, what was it at 3 or 4 years ago where you said to yourself, "I'm just going to throw my lot in with the people everyone calls schismatics"? What was the impetus for that?
Well, now that you ask that, let me say it might be right to ask it another way. It's like, why did it take me so long to come back? All right, because I was raised with it, and I remember I was born in 1950, so for my childhood, it was all the traditional Latin Mass, very badly done at the local parish. Sunday Mass was a low Mass, and it was said in about 19 minutes. The priest clearly didn't like it, just would race through the Latin. But one of my brothers was an altar boy, and I was envious in the sense that he got to learn Latin, and I'd kind of help him with his Latin, and we liked it. All right, there was no desire to have the vernacular. It never came into anybody's mind like there's something strange about a Latin Mass. It was the Mass, and then when the vernacular came in, it was shocking. I mean, like nobody expected it. And like, what was this being imposed upon us all of a sudden? And that's was what 1965. You had the first. The first was not bad because it was basically the translation of the Latin Mass, and so you just read the right hand side instead of the left hand side. So okay, we can handle that. And then all of a sudden, I go off to college, and that's when the Novus Ordo came in, and I left the church for a little while. And when I came back, I was just kind of, what the heck is this? And then it just kept getting worse in the sense that more and more innovation, crazy stuff, crazy stuff. I sort of sit at the back of the Mass, and I'm just thinking, I hate the music. There's nothing. I didn't even know there was sort of an underground Latin Mass thing that was possible. I didn't know anything about it until I got into graduate school, and actually became a friend with, Anne Muggeridge, who was Anne, you know the Muggeridges, surely by reputation. Well, Anne and I were actually close personal friends after a period of time, and she was definitely a Latin Mass person. When I'd visit her, I'd go to the Latin Mass, but it had to be done in a schoolroom. Nothing grand about it. You felt like you were, underground, which you were, and so it wasn't really available. All right. And then I also realized that with my work on Humanae Vitae, I didn't need one more mark of being a retrograde of some kind. So I didn't really seek it out. All right. And I never thought, I really wanted it in my heart. I wanted it all that time, but it was one of those precious things that was just not going to be available to me. I was at Notre Dame. The masses were a lot of them were just awful. I mean, you would have nuns stand up around the table and basically look like they're consecrating, co-consecrating. They moved, of course, I knew at the time when they moved the tabernacle, they couldn't do it in the main church at Notre Dame. It was impossible. But in the crypt, they moved it to the side, put it basically in the room where they stored the excess chairs and brooms. And I was, literally devastated, physically devastated by this. And I went to Dallas. Very good friends there went to the Latin Mass. Should have joined them. I regret it now. Spent a lot of time trying to convince my friend that she was and it was SSPX, that she was not in full union with the church. I've apologized since for my resistance to her wisdom. And so I came back, and it's actually at my parish church. And and also this was at the time of the whole McCarrick thing. They started doing it at my parish. And I couldn't believe it. It was like, I couldn't stand the Novus Ordo anymore because for my mind, it was the church I had come to know. It was the church that there was abuse in. And it's just, I'm not going to leave the church, but I could go to the Latin Mass, and it was in every possible way better for my system. I worshiped better. I prayed better. I got closer to the Lord. I still go to the Novus Ordo. We don't have a TLM daily available. The masses here are largely said very reverently. But if I had a TLM, I only go on vacations where there's a TLM available because it's one of my treats to myself is that I get to go to the TLM. Now, what I want to say about that in Africa, um, I think they're ripe for it. People have this idea of some people, have this idea of Africans as just being crazy, wild, spontaneous, doing all these crazy dances. And even if you see the native dances, they're extremely ordered. They're extremely disciplined. The Ugandan people struck me as being very disciplined people. They like order. There's a way that things look like chaos, and I actually think I said it in one of the articles. I think it's because of the eucalyptus tree, which is one of the strongest trees there is, but it's not a straight tree. It's a crooked tree. So everywhere you see these eucalyptus trees holding up big buildings and little roadside stands, and you have this sense of everything is a little bit wobbly. But you go to a mass, oh my goodness. The children, there was never a moment where there was a need for any kind of discipline. They would sit there for the longest time simply being quiet. They would sing, and some of the beautiful singing. They did one classical hymn in one of the masses. They will clap because the music calls for it. But when it was a traditional hymn, they had that same sense of look of beautiful transcendence, that their whole spirits had been lifted up. So again, I had this conversation. Before I went, I tried to see if there was a TLM in Kampala, which is the capital where was our base, and to my surprise, they had one. So I mentioned to Father Alex. I said I have to go. He said, "Oh no, we don't have such a thing here." I said, "There's a website." And so he went. He said, "We have such a thing here." So, being a beautiful, accommodating man, he went down to check it out first to see if it really was and when the mass was, and why do you want to go to this? He tells me, and I said, when I asked the seminarians and the faculty, they had never been, and most of them have never heard of it. Vast majority had never heard of the traditional Latin Mass, and so they do the Novus Ordo in Latin once a month or maybe more at some of the seminaries. So they're not opposed to Latin per se, but Father was. When I told him the structure of the Mass, what the whole thrust of the Mass was, how you entered, how the asparagus, I just went through the Mass. Ad Orientem, the communion rail, he was just, oh, that sounds wonderful. Oh my goodness, that sounds great. I can see that. I can see the advantage to that. And it was astonished at how boom, 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 he saw it. And then you get to the Latin. No, I don't see that. And we had at least half an hour of discussion. I said, I'm not getting anywhere. I said, let's just not have this conversation till afterwards. And he'd already said 2 masses that morning, and he actually was hoping he could celebrate, and he didn't. I had to explain to him why he couldn't at the TLM. And he just loves the Lord and he loves the Mass. And so we went, and it was unbelievably beautiful. There might probably between 75 and 100. It was at a shrine for the first Ugandan martyr in Kampala in an outdoor pavilion. A French order says the Mass, but it was an English young man who was the priest, again, with all the due dignity, women veiled, men dressed beautifully, in plastic chairs, outdoor pavilion, beautiful. And afterwards, I say to Father, what do you think? He said, he says, I understand now. He said, and then he asked, he said, do you think it's going to come back? Do you think it will be the church, the Mass of the future of the church? And I said, oh, do I hope so? But and you're not so surprised, and I'm not so surprised that someone who has, and I think my suspicion is the culture, the church in Uganda is this way. They have a very profound natural reverence. And when they encounter a Mass that feeds that natural reverence, they will immediately, as he did, immediately accept it. I was wanted, not just accepted, wanted. And I was telling one of the rectors of the seminary, I talked again, Ad Orientem, communion rail, the procession in 13, 18, 20, altar boys, etc., etc. He says, you got me at the asparagus. He said, I'm with you. And I was just like, this is right. They immediately see the fittingness of a very formal liturgy. So I was thrilled.
You know,
And they,
sorry, go
go
on.
ahead.
You go on.
Well, they would say, "Will you come again?" And again, I don't know if I meant this, and I don't know if I can pull this off, but I said, if I can bring the Latin Mass with me, I'll come again. And they all look at me like, "What?" And I said, "Well, why not? I mean, why don't I come and give a day of talks at the seminary, and then the next day we have an introduction to the Latin Mass, and we do a Latin Mass." I said, "It seems to me that this would be a very good thing to do." No, they didn't say, "Well, no, 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 no." They're all sort of, they're just kind of like, "Well, that's a thought." So pray for that. It'd be nice if that
That's
could happen.
amazing. During the resistance to the African bishops, pretty much the whole continent resisting the fiducia supplicans
Yes.
nonsense. I actually had someone reach out to me on behalf of an African bishop, a French-speaking bishop, and because a lot of people forget Archbishop Lefebvre, he spent
Right.
time in Africa until the 60s. I mean, many of these men are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s now, and they remember that, and they were formed in that as children, and so he actually basically said, my bishop wants to say congratulations and so forth on your work on this, and go Archbishop Lefebvre, and we hope that he's recognized as a saintly man and all this kind of stuff. And so I did a video in French. I do speak French. I
Mm.
obviously I don't do my channel in French, but I'm fluent in French. So I did a video in French, just sort of in homage to that, and it was interesting to see the comments from a lot of the French speaking Africans. And last story I'll tell is, you mentioned the orderedness and the sort of the good. There's such thing as good folk music, and Dr. Kwasniewski talks about this in his book on music, and in Archbishop Lefebvre's biography. It's funny, people believed he was a moderate at the time because he recognized that as well, having spent 30 years on the continent, that he was allowing them before the funeral began in the church that they could do some of their pious African Christian customs, carrying the casket and so forth to the church, because he said it was beautiful, it was perfectly wonderful, there was nothing offensive about it. It was a true enculturation, as they like to throw that word around. So I'm right with you there, and I really do hope that Africa, the African Catholic churches, do embrace the traditional mass. I think that'd be wonderful.
Oh, I'm with you. I mean, I thought it was a very dignified culture, um, very joyful. I mean, that part of the reason I think that their liturgy is strange to us is because we're just not as joyful a people as they are. If someone said this morning, I saw in some tweet that the difference between the divine liturgy of the Byzantine church was sort of like, heaven just bursting through into to our world, and the Latin Mass is being, what they said, a joyful funeral. Now, I thought, okay. I mean, again, I've been now going, as often, and Sunday for sure, and other times the traditional Latin Mass. But to get yourself into the notion that this really is a very serious sacrifice that you're making. Not like the Novus Ordo, where it's just sort of like a party. And just woo, 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 everything good, God loves us, as opposed to we owe God He showed us how to make the sacrifice He performed for us. He offered for us the sacrifice that we're supposed to give to Him for our own wretchedness. And so that you certainly do get a more profound sense of man's wretchedness in the traditional Latin Mass than you do in the Novus Ordo. I think that's extremely healthy, especially in our culture that's based entirely upon self-affirmation and self-approval, to be able to be self-critical. But I think whatever the Africans are likely to do something really beautiful with their Latin Mass, that won't be a distortion of it, but will be bringing their beautiful spirit um, to it. Whether it's, I mean, they had this diocesan day where every parish sends a group to the cathedral, and all the women are, of course, the African dress for women is just gorgeous, unbelievable colors up against their black skin. I mean, I look like a washed out, whatever the whole time, and there they are in this beautiful garb and headdresses and um, gorgeous, and the men too, very, very great sophistication, and they had outside, not just pavilions with food for after it, and Not everybody could get in the cathedrals because there's so many people. Hours. It was they were coming for the day. They're coming for the day. And this is what I was in Africa maybe 30 years ago, and I spoke after a couple masses, and they were there for the whole afternoon. And I said to something, "This is how'd you manage to get these people here for a whole afternoon?" He said, "Well, that's what they know what Sunday is for. This is where they want to be. They're not rushing home to watch a football game or clean the garage. They are Sunday is for God." And that's the sense you had, is that Sunday is for God. You don't hurry mass. You don't hurry. When I was in South Africa, they said they didn't know about liturgies that lasted less than 2 hours. And they said, we hear that in the United States that even ordinations are like only 2.5 hours. And I said, well, how long are they here? They said 6 to 7 hours. They said that's how long it takes, because we have to thank God for everything that's happening here and celebrate an ordination. What would you have more important to do than that? So I mean, this is what I had a sense of what their culture was, and we don't want to lose that. And I think the Latin Mass will fit perfectly into that context.
I agree. We every Sunday, my wife and I look at each other. We're like, okay, this is going to be a good day, obviously, but we got 6 kids under 8 years old, so it's a little bit of a thing. And we're like, okay, what do we got to bring for after Mass? Because we're clearly going to be here for 2 or 3 hours after, and the kids are going to be. One time I go out and my 2 oldest boys, they're 8 and 7, and they're playing football on the grass in front of the church with other kids, and they're using my son Titus's shoe as the football. So they're all playing in their socks and so forth, and it's a common occurrence. That's a very beautiful thing. Okay, so we've shown the fundraiser for the seminary formation, and you mentioned the book thing. Is there a place that people can go for the book donation thing?
I got a email just this morning from Matthew at the Arlington Last site, and I'm sure he'll be putting it on that site soon.
Okay.
Of an email that people can send to, that they have books, and he'll make sure I get that information, and then we'll negotiate about how where we ship the books. This is an idea that's more or less just in novo. It's new, and we're just figuring out, do they want everything sent here, or are we going to buy rent a storage place somewhere near a shipping container? I'll have to get my guy on that. See
All
what
right.
we can do.
And then anywhere else people can find your work besides Crisis Magazine? Anything else you'd like to promote?
I have a website, janetsmith.org, where I have almost all my talks. If anybody finds a talk somewhere else on the internet that I don't have up there, there's a place you can contact my assistant on that page, and we'll get it up there. So I'm trying to get, and everything's for free. My talk, Contraception, Why Not, and the myths of contraception, contraceptive myths, they're all up there that people can download for free. And I'm finding too many young people have never heard of my talk, Contraception, Why Not? And that makes me a little sad. So I think, and one thing I always, there, look at you. It's right there. One of my recommendations, if you want your young adults in your family to listen to it, ask them to do that for you for Mother's Day or Father's Day. Say, I don't want anything, which you really don't, but say, please listen to this and then talk to me afterwards. That's a good way to get it out there.
That's wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'll put the links for both of for the fundraiser and also for Miss Smith's website underneath this video podcast, whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on the audio platforms. Thank you very much, Janet. Also, I would like to just say thank you to you for, you and I have been emailing, and you've given me some good advice and help with things. And I just want to say thank you for the type of sort of mentorship and help you've been giving me as well.
Well, I can't tell you how delightful it is for me to meet people like you, young men with large families who are making a huge part of their vocation in this world, or contribution to this world. There's such things as the podcast. You bring a very passionate voice that is mostly balanced.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Well, thank you.
But the fervor is beautiful, and I don't want you to tamp it down. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Maybe I'm 36. Maybe in about 20 or 30 years, I'll start to calm down a bit, or I might not. Maybe I'll get worse. But all right, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to hear more of what I have to say, which I don't know why you would, but if you're a glutton for punishment, you can sign up for my Substack. Right now, I'm doing a book study on They Have Uncrowned Him. I'm just going to bring it up on the screen for you here. I'm doing a book study right now on They've Uncrowned Him by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. And you can see the first episode there, ladies and gentlemen. It's basically just, we're just going through basically a collection of chapters. And it's really just sort of kind of like a class. I used to be a teacher. I do miss it. That's one of the things that I'm doing there, as well as there are certain sort of premium podcasts and so forth. And after you've donated to this Uganda fundraiser, and after you've thought about what books you're going to send, if you have any considerations left, maybe decide to become a premium member. It does help me keep the lights on, and so to speak, for my 6 kids. So I appreciate all of your help. All right, my friends, I'm going to remind you this, ladies and gentlemen. I did change the name of my podcast from the Kennedy Report. I didn't really like that name. It was given to me when I did a newsy thing for the Fatima Center, and that was great. But I don't really like the news very much. It drives me nuts. So now I've just called it Mere Tradition, which is all I really care about, is just Mere Tradition. So thank you for listening or watching another episode of Mere Tradition, and I will see you next time. And Janet, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.